If I can get the mic on. All right, here we go. Hello and welcome. Thank you all for being here. This is the Kubernetes 101 Do-It-Yourself workshop. If you're confused, welcome to my world. I submitted a 3-hour workshop, and they were like, fantastic, it's accepted. Please do this in 35 minutes. And I thought, that will be interesting. We're not going to actually hands-on do the workshop because, well, it's 3 hours long. But what we can do is talk you through how to do everything in it so you can do it yourself, which is why you're here. I am here because, hi, my name is Bridget. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is probably the most Scandinavian place in the United States. Like, we say, yeah, sure, you betcha. And have places like named like Askoff and Finlayson. So, and I work in Microsoft. I found one shirt in the employee store that I actually liked because it's glittery. And I do cloud developer advocacy there, which means that I work at Microsoft. I have a Mac with a Microsoft asset tag on it, and my job is to get people to do Linux stuff with Kubernetes. Ideally on Azure, if you would like. Yeah, I know, we live in a very interesting new world. I also, if you're thinking, why does she doesn't look familiar, but she sounds familiar, you may have heard my voice on the podcast Arrested DevOps that I co-host. And I also am the chief cook and bottle washer at the global enterprise known as DevOps Days, by which I mean the loosely associated federation of community conferences. There are DevOps Days near you. There's going to be one in Stockholm in May. So take a look at devopsdays.org for that. We have 55 events this year, I think, on 6 continents. So get in touch if you want to run one in one of your cities. And look at devopsdays.org because we have open CFPs for a bunch of European cities right now. Okay, so that's the About Me slide. So, what is this? I feel like when people start with an outline like this, I immediately kind of am like, all right, spoilers. But what we're going to talk about, because we don't have tons of time together, what we're going to talk about is, what is this? Let's look at the content. Talk about some of the opinions, because, spoiler alert, every time you do anything, you're making choices. You're choosing what to put in, what to take out, what to leave out. And going over just a few of the details. We'll see how many we have time to get to. And then we'll have, of course, the traditional call to action. Spoiler alert there, pull requests accepted. Okay, so. I feel like this is what happens at a lot of conferences, right? You go to the conference, maybe you do the really long workshop, and you get really energized. You did a lot of hands-on wonderful stuff, maybe with those fine folks from Heptio. You know a lot now. You want to bring it back to your organization. And the people who are at home are like full of sad and FOMO, and they wish they were there at KubeCon with you. And then when you get back to your organization, and they're like, okay, share with us what you learned. And you're like, it was a great workshop. And it's really hard sometimes to replicate that experience for the people back home. And you're like, okay, you can stand up Minikube, and that's cool. Or there's you can go do Kelsey's Kubernetes the hard way, and that's awesome, but takes a lot of time. And it's like, is there something that's like between those two things? And I feel like there can be if Kubernetes is democratizing distributed systems for us, I feel like we can democratize learning about the distributed systems. And we're doing that with open source Kubernetes training. I mean, obviously, open source all the things, right? So some of you may know Jerome Petazzoni. He was at Docker for a long time, and he is French and lives in Berlin these days. And he created an open source container training that is worth checking out, and we're gonna dive into it because that's what we're using for this particular workshop. And he added some Kubernetes modules that I've been expanding, and we'll take a look at some of the stuff that I added. Just a quick level set, when I call this 101, both in terms of when we run the actual workshop and here where we're doing a quick survey overview so you can run the workshop yourself, what I mean by 101 is I want to start in a place with things people are familiar with. Like, they're probably familiar with SSHing to things, running commands, maybe a little bit of Docker. I don't expect any knowledge whatsoever if someone's participating in this of Kubernetes itself. So I feel like there's a lot of times where they're like, and now, and you look at the 900 things to be defined, and you're like, what? There's so many things. And this does not even try to define the 900 things. And that kind of brings us to the limiting the unnecessary details. And again, this is back to meandering opinions. in some contexts, you could think every one of those details is important and necessary for some reason. Yes, it absolutely is, but do beginners who are using something for the first time need every one of those details? Probably not. So we don't go into all those details. And then the third part, which does mean that it's kind of difficult to pull out sections of this workshop and use them standalone, is that it builds understanding incrementally. Because it is really difficult as humans for us to learn something if we get a giant pile of information at once. And we retain stuff better if we come to a realization ourselves, as opposed to having everything handed to us. So that's what this workshop is trying to do. All right, so to start with, the way we deliver it. This is, and I'm going to jump out of the slides for a minute here and go to a web page, and you can take a look. It is on the internet. It is available to you to look at right now. Container.training. This is the upcoming ones, and there is one, for example, there's a swarm orchestration one coming up in Budapest. I'm doing a Kubernetes 101 in Minnesota next week. I'm doing one at Velocity San Jose, OSCON, etc. And we do publish the slides. I'm going to take us to the slides for the one that I just did in Chicago last week, so you can see. And this is literally, you will see there are 365 slides, and we get through this in 3 hours. So there's a lot of material there, but it's also key. It's all available online, so people can work through it on their own later. More on that in a minute. And probably the mechanics that Jerome built in are kind of nice, especially, and we'll get to the content there in a minute, but especially this takes us to GitHub. So I click this, well, we'll see if our internet wants to work here, and that takes me to the exact slide, the exact content on GitHub. So this is back to the open source part. If you want to take these materials and adapt them and use them to train people in your workplace, fork the repo and put in content that's relevant to your interests. Okay, let's see. So that's when we're going through, actually taking people through the training, usually we get to chapters 1 and 2 in the first hour and a half, just taking people through running some containers, exposing services, that sort of thing. After the break, do a bunch of stuff with the dashboard, all the fun security things, scaling a deployment, daemon sets, yada, yada, yada. And then adding a few things. This section is where it's been under active development recently. You can, again, it's all open source. You can go look at GitHub. You can see what we've been adding. Stuff around Stern and Helm, adding in tools that we can give you a set of YAML that you don't have to really understand, but you can at least apply it and start looking at it. This is another place where this training is very modular. If you are training people with it, you can add a bunch of site-specific modules or things about doing your builds or whatever, after people have some understanding of Kubernetes itself. Okay, so enough on the slides for the moment, though again, they're on container.training, you can go look at them. But that's what people interact with when they are using the, when you are giving this training. By the way, I think I've done 5 or 6 of these in the last 3 months. But I hadn't even really looked at this repo before I decided to start doing this in December, January. So I think it's not that hard to onboard on. If you have a little bit of time to kind of dig through some of the stuff, it's not that hard to understand just enough to teach people a little bit more. And I think that's another thing, by the way, that we all like to be an acknowledged expert on something before we ever help anyone else with it. And it's you know what? I am not a Kubernetes expert, but I know just enough to help other people learn a little bit themselves. So, all right. So that's delivering the training itself. What the training is, and again, this is not a, I feel it's really easy to lose yourself in complexity, but it's also not useful if you want to use Kubernetes and you don't want to spend all your time developing Kubernetes. It's not super useful if you don't have an application that actually has independently scalable microservices and that sort of thing. So this application that is available in our repo, I will pop back over to it, let's take this through. All right, oh yeah, setting it up with pre-provisioned clusters. I'll get to that in just a second. yeah, again, this is blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to actually go through all those slides because I want to just jump to what's in this repo. So this Docker Coins application, it has a random number generator, it has a hasher, a worker that just generates traffic, and then a web interface so that people have like different pieces that they can scale up and down or break or look at the logs of. And I think that's kind of key. Like that's the important takeaway there is if you have a sample application that has some different components that part of it can be working and part of it can't, or some of it'll be putting out logs in a different way, that's really helpful when people are trying to see what the different parts look like. Okay, so like, yeah. Again, not being prescriptive here, you could use your local application, but just make sure you have something that people can see the parts of when they're seeing it on Kubernetes. We show it just stood up on one node, like with Docker Compose, before we go to Kubernetes too, so people can see the differences. Okay, all right, so setup. And this is, again, like your setup stuff is going to vary depending on what your local environment is. That's interesting. I just hit escape and I got a blank screen. Your setup is going to vary. I'm going to say like the setup that we use specifically for this workshop. I'm going to just go to terminal here. Am I still online? Good. Is in the Git repo. Let's see how much of that is readable. But this is like we set up. You can either use AWS, or if you're not using AWS, we literally haven't modified the scripts to assume anything else. So I'm setting up into Azure, and I just set all the AWS access keys or whatever to nothing. But for example, let's go to the Azure setup. To launch instances, and I did already do this, so you don't have to sit there and watch me do it, but I did already do this, but you launch instances in your cloud of choice. By the way, if any of you use or work at Google or use Google Cloud and would like to submit a pull request, we have instructions and copy and pastable stuff in here for AWS and for Azure, so it would be nice to get some for GCP too. And I have cloud privilege in that I have all the free Azure I can eat. I do not have free GCP, so I'm not setting that up, but pull request accepted. But this is like just create a group and launch the resources. This is, by the way, when I run these, and I'll show you what the output looks like. When I run these, I don't do, let's see. I don't run them, I don't know how readable that is, but I don't run them like individually myself. We actually have a training department that I gave some ARM templates to, and I'll show you those templates. But again, this is a bunch of output just showing that we have launched a bunch of instances in Azure. I have some instances, they have IP addresses. We have some scripts. I'm not going to take you through and there is a bunch of janky bash in Python, and most of the Python is Jerome. I take responsibility for the jankiness of the bash. I own my shitty bash programming. That's me. That's all me. But take a look at what we do to configure these, because. And this is key, I think, for these workshops, because you can go into a workshop scenario and spend the first half of the day like configuring your clusters. We want to hand people pre-configured clusters. So we go through and configure these clusters. This is setting up clusters that have Docker and whatnot installed on them, and then installing the Kubernetes stuff. So, and this is all with parallel SSH. A caveat, and we'll get to the warnings and caveats, because there are a bunch of things to worry about. And again, pull requests accepted, because we could use some improvements in some of these scripts. But, oh yeah, and then I tried to, I left this in here to show you that sometimes you think you remember how to do the tests, and I was like, these tests are all failing. Oh, right, I was trying to do kube test, not test. I had to go look and see what it was. All this does is like look and see if my cluster is healthy. So. Anyway, this is like the setup stuff. If you're going to run the workshop, you run some scripts, stand up your instances, run some scripts to install necessary things on them and configure them, get them into clusters, and then you generate these cards. Now let's take a look at these cards, because again, this is probably the thing, if you've done workshops at conferences, this is the thing that is the most exciting / impressive. By the way, I did go through and change the password on these, so you can't actually log in and do anything entertaining to them. But if you can see that, I hope you can see that in the back. What I'm showing you there is Literally, this script generates these. You can print these and hand these little cards out to people. And if you've ever been to a workshop where they're like, step 1, log into this, log into your thing. Oh, you don't remember your live.com account? And you're like, I can't use the free pass credits because I can't log into the thing, and it's really frustrating. Or you don't have the right sort of phone number. They expect a US phone number for you to validate, and it's really frustrating. You don't have to do any of that if you walk into, or for your attendees walking into a workshop and you just hand them credentials. It's like, all right, great, I can sit down, I can go. So that's and this is all customizable. We have, there are config files in the repo so that, and we have enough time. We'll look at that really quickly in a bit. This is the sort of thing that if you're going to generate information and you want it to go to a specific URL that says other things, that's all configurable. Okay, so that's the setup stuff. Back to, so the even more details, and I went over a little bit of that, but the even more details that I want to highlight is again, this is, let's make it so that this is readable. This is the, here, we'll go to GitHub, that'll make it easier to see. The preparing the VM stuff is in here. It's in container training, prepare VMs. We have a pretty detailed README in here that explains how to do it for AWS and Azure, like I said. This, by the way, and you could be using anything you want to use. If you like Terraform or whatever, use that. I'm not particularly attached to ARM templates. I just have an ARM template in here that I got to work because our training department wanted ARM templates. So it's okay. But here, I will show you that the kind of stuff, if you are generating these, this is just the public key that we put on all the nodes. This is so that if you want to pre-configure things, but you want to pre-configure them on the fly with whatever is current. You don't necessarily want to bake AMIs or something. So it's a little bit easier if you drop an SSH key on all the nodes that you can then configure your instances. You can set the number of instances that you want in your cluster, the VM size for your cloud, et cetera. Okay, so there's a bunch of detail in there around setup that there's things you can adjust, but probably, I would say the only other thing that I change frequently is the versions of things that you want to use, and that's all configurable in here too. If you want to be on the stable Docker engine, or if you want to be on a test version, or I suppose, yes, the rest of the world uses reasonable metric everything. So, okay. All right, so anyway, there's a bunch of configuration details in there, and there are instructions in the README. I feel like I could make them better. It's kind of I came in, something was already in progress, I made changes to it. I documented some of them, and it would probably be a good idea for someone else to try it now and see how good my docs actually are. Okay, so caveats. The biggest thing is that the parallel SSH stuff can time out. So we did increase a bunch of the timeouts, but this is going to depend a lot on your cloud and the speed in your region, and this is key, your actual connectivity from where you are. So something that I haven't set up yet in Azure, but we do have an AWS template for, is a control node so that you're actually doing all the configuration scripts from inside the cloud. So I'm running these configuration scripts from my laptop on conference Wi-Fi. I can have timeouts, there can be issues. So that's a place for improvement that I haven't completely improved. And then another thing to watch out for is if you're going to run a workshop either for your company or at an event, and people are not super clear with you with how many people are going to be there, you can end up needing to quickly provision a bunch of new nodes. So there are a few things that can be problematic like that. But the stuff that we want to add, and we're gonna dive into some of what's in there right now, but I feel like there's a lot of really interesting stuff that once you have a Kubernetes cluster, you can add, and then we'll play with this with it. Then we'll try this, then we'll try that. I think that let's look at what's in there now, and then I would love suggestions for what should be in there, because there is a bunch of interesting stuff, but okay, so let's take a look through what is actually there now. We've already got the VMs prepared, so let's take a look at the VMs themselves. Let's log into them. We have, oh, and I should look. This is the, let's see, I have a different window that I opened. Yep. Okay, so this is the file, and when you create a bunch of VMs, you actually you just get all the IP addresses in this file. So if you've configured things, you saw in the configuration file, these are 3 node clusters, then it's going to take 3 in a row and configure them, then the next 3 and configure them, et cetera. And that's going to be based on like what you've set in that configuration file. So if you spin up a bunch of instances and then change your mind about how you want to configure them, that's fine as long as you haven't run those configuration scripts yet. But anyway, so for these ones, I know that this one is node 1. And we could see that, let's see, up here. Let me scroll back up. Here we go. So you can see that this one is our node 1. So I'm going to go log into it, just so we can go look at it. And you will recall, by the way, the Docker @ username is hard-coded in right now, mostly because there's certain privileges that go with the Docker user that we just haven't set up a different user. We might change it to training or something, but. Okay, so. So I have nodes here. I set them up 11 hours ago, like when I got back from the party thing last night. And this is, again, this is one of those things where there's a lot of, this is back to the like meandering and opinions. Some people might say, oh, that's not fun. You gave me a cluster that's already configured. And other people are like, oh, that's great because we want to do a lot of things with the cluster and we don't want to spend time configuring it. So depending on what the use cases are inside your organization and how people want to be interacting with Kubernetes, this could be perfect. And again, like you're like, oh, well, what about Minikube? Yeah, that's cool, but this is like a multi-node cluster. So that's why there's kind of there's a bunch of different ways you can do this, but this way works for us in terms of giving people a multi-node cluster in the cloud of their choice that they can interact with. Okay, so let's go back to the repo. Specifically, let's go back to container.training itself, like the, oh, no. Okay. Go back to these slides. So when we're taking people through this, let's go to here. Probably like the most, we'll go to the how we set it up. So we set, and there all the scripts for setting this up are in the repo, so you can see it. But there's back to the opinionated. There's a few opinions in here that I want to highlight, just so that you can kind of see like what we chose to do. We're using kubeadm. That does mean if you're familiar enough with Kubernetes, and by the way, if you came to this assuming that this was a hands-on 101 workshop, I am sorry, but you can go to container.training and do the 101 workshop if you want to, like without me. But kubeadm has a couple of characteristics, like it sets up a kube public namespace, for example, for the token that it uses for bootstrapping. So there's a few things like that that you wouldn't necessarily see with clusters that are provisioned a different way. But that's okay. I mean, it's just opinions. It makes it easier. We use Weave for our overlay network, and that's not a like Weave is the choice. There's a zillion choices. It's pretty uncomplicated and just grab some YAML and go. So. But again, that's pluggable, that's in the configuration scripts. You could choose to do that a different way. We'll take a look at that script too, maybe. And then the part that makes this a little bit trickier in terms of scriptability is the passing around the token. So that's why bootstrapping the clusters can be a little bit messy if you don't have something in place that does that. And yeah, there is a link in here to the README that explains a little bit more. So let's go back to that README. This is trainer tool stuff. This is the one we were looking at in VI, but probably if you look at all these and you think, that's way more commands than I want, that's fine. You don't need most of them. Most of them is you just either follow these examples to launch AWS instances or these examples to launch Azure instances, or please pull request in the examples to launch instances somewhere else. And then to configure them, if you want to configure instances, like for example, from a non-AWS source, you just need to have the IP addresses and the ability to SSH into them, and then generate cards. And then, let's see, there's a bunch of stuff we could add, but that's where that is right now. Okay, so KubeADM, again, like it isn't perfect. It doesn't do absolutely everything. It's more complicated than Swarm. But there's also a bunch of other choices, and we have this specifically because we want people to have the opportunity to interact with the master node. But if you more want people to be developing applications on Kubernetes and you don't want or need them to be interacting with the master node, then other than like through the API, there are a bunch of options. And again, this is a deliberately cloud agnostic when we give it as a workshop because we want people to be able to adapt it to their needs. But there are a number of like managed Kubernetes options available on the various clouds that, again, depending on what your needs are, might make your life significantly easier. There's also links here to a number of other tools for launching and configuring clusters, again, depending on your needs. So take a look and see what works best for you, but you do have options. Okay, and there are a few other options too, like if you're a fan of Ansible or Terraform, or if you want to go through Kelsey's tutorial and do everything the hard way. Again, these links are all available on container.training. The Kubernetes documentation, I think, has a really good guide for picking the exact right solution, but this is, again, production-grade solutions. So we're setting up something that's kind of quick and dirty and mostly for training purposes. Okay, so when we have everything set up, we start by explaining to people, and this is where the abstractions start being a little bit weird, just clarifying that you're not directly interacting with containers and talking about pods. And I know all of you, if you're Kubernetes experts, that all seems completely obvious, but think back to when you weren't a Kubernetes expert. And it's people actually do need this explained. And this interacting, and this is one example, and we can do this. I mean, we can do if we wanted to, do a kubectl run, and we can just call it something, and ping Cloudflare's DNS resolver. I mean, why not? We can do that. This again, and if you're running a 101 class and you're training someone, and they see this and they're like, okay, what just happened? And getting into what just happened is where you can explain a bunch of things, looking at the resources that were created. And again, this can all seem super obvious, but everyone starts somewhere. And just starting and seeing and looking at this and talking about what these components are is a really good place to start. And so these materials we go through, let's explain exactly what's going on there. Also, I'm sure all of you probably, or some of you probably recall the exciting days a few weeks ago of 1.10.0, where suddenly all of the, the PO and RE and whatever were suddenly gone. And now they're much, much longer. So it's okay, whatever. As long as they're actually displayed as to what they are. But looking at the deployments, the replica sets, and the pods, and interacting with those. And then, so that's, again, it's hands-on, and that we're going to, and we won't probably have time in this little overview, but this materials takes people through, okay, what happens if you destroy a pod? Okay, what happens if you destroy a replica set? Oh, okay, if we want to get rid of ping pong and stop annoying Cloudflare with our pings, we have to actually destroy the deployment. Okay, and that's the kind of thing. Oh, and the other thing, and again, this is when people are new to a space, and especially if you come into a job with a Kubernetes deployment or a Kubernetes installation already in progress, and you're not familiar with Kubernetes at all, and you see a bunch of things like replication controllers. And you're like, okay, let me find the replication controller. Yeah, that doesn't exist anymore. Fast-moving space, things get renamed all the time, and having a little bit of compassion for people who are coming in and saying, wait, what? Getting the ability to dereference pointers from something that is used and something isn't used. It's kind of useful and / important. And so like this, we go through the materials in terms of like what this does. Let's look at the logs, et cetera. Let's, we could scale and let's just do one, just to kind of watch it. But this is the sort of thing where, and again, something else I do when I'm training with these is I don't usually type everything because people get really tired of watching your typos and it's slow. But I don't just copy and paste something and then hit return really fast because then they don't see what I've typed. And of course, they have the materials up in front of them, but like talking about, okay, we're scaling the deployment. We're not scaling, say, the replica set, because then the deployment would just scale it back down. So we do this, and then we say, am I going to make people mad if I say kubectl? Getting people like used to interacting with kube control, or whatever we want to call it, I feel like that's the most ridiculous. It's a fun thing for us to argue about, so it's kind of nice to have something that is totally zero stakes to argue about. But this is like taking people through interactively, like let's destroy a pod, et cetera. We can talk about like different things you can do, but just doing some of the really simple things is, I think, where this workshop shines. Let's see, like we have just a couple of other things, and I only have a couple minutes left, so I'll just say, yeah. This starts like, you can go into, and again, the workshop is really only using cluster IP and node port. So if you're interested in or familiar with or whatever, like load balancer, external name, or any of the other service types, we don't really go into those, but we kind of mention that they exist. I think this is one of those things, it's like, you can't cover the entire universe, so you kind of just have to decide which stuff you want to cover. I wanted to talk about virtual kubelet really quick, because I think this is how it can be kind of interesting to add or build other things. I mean, that's kind of why we're all here, right? We're at a Kubernetes conference, so we're all nerds. We all want to build stuff. If you haven't yet, just go look at the virtual kubelet project, because it's kind of cool, because it lets people add something to the cluster that's completely outside the cluster that they're just addressing virtually, but it appears as a cluster, as a node inside the cluster. So that's something that some of my coworkers have worked on. I think they were hacking on that right before KubeCon in Austin back in December. So that's the sort of thing that I hope that I'll have time to add to the workshop in terms of like another interactive thing that we can work on at the end. Aside from like the stern and helm. Jerome added an EFK stack, and I immediately found that I was running out of memory on the pretty low memory Azure nodes that I had provisioned. And I was like, which kind of nodes are you using over in AWS? And he told me, and I was like, oh, those nodes are much more expensive. I will have to have that discussion with the training department. But then I spun it up, and I was still having problems. And it's an iterative process to figure out exactly which pieces, and this was also, he was doing a 2-day workshop. So I was like, I don't have time to go into an EFK stack. Elasticsearch, Fluent, and Kibana. I was like, I don't actually have time to go into that in a 3-hour workshop anyway, so I'm not going to worry about it for now. But I am going to be adding some virtual kubelet stuff, because that's kind of interesting. So yeah, so I guess the call to action for you folks is that if it seems interesting to you to take a look at the stuff on container.training, take a look at the stuff on the Git repo, and if it's interesting to you, please add some stuff, because we have a bunch of open pull requests that I think are for the Swarm stuff that Jerome needs to go deal with later. But we have a couple of open issues, but mostly this has mostly been a 2 to 3 person effort, and I think that it could be a lot bigger than that if you want to build really cool stuff inside your organizations with it. Because, and this is basically the ridiculous takeaway is, like I said at the beginning, Microsoft gave me a Mac, and are paying me to help people with Linux, which is proof that 2018 is super weird. And even if we live in the darkest timeline, it's actually kind of awesome too. It's pretty exciting, actually. So I want us to keep building this really cool stuff together. And there's I would say the further links of things that, takeaways that I recommend looking at is the links to the container training website and GitHub are there. And again, like I work for Microsoft, if you want to spin up some stuff that's much more zero effort, you can certainly use ACS. Spoiler alert, go watch next week at Build. There will be exciting announcements. And I mean, it's a company conference, there's always announcements. And then the virtual kubelet project is pretty interesting. So people would like to work on that too. That's it, I'm out of time. People are excited to go to their next thing as well. But I'd be happy to chat with folks more offline. Thanks.